Hey Calgary, CJSW 90.9 FM is independent, volunteer run, and listener funded.
Today on the Hearsay podcast for PBSC, we have myself, Madeline Anthony. I am a 2L student here at the university, and I have with me Professor Jennifer Koshan. If you don't mind giving us a little bit of an introduction to yourself.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Madeline. My name is Jennifer Koshan. I have been a professor in the Faculty of Law for 25 years now, and I teach in the areas of constitutional law, human rights, and gender-based violence.
Amazing. And outside of the school, my understanding is you have quite the involvement in the gender violence and sort of related topic space. And so that's why we have you here with us today as sort of our resident expert. And so our main topic today is going to be the sort of trio of legislation that's in Alberta these days, Bills 26, 27, and 29. And would you mind just giving our listeners a quick overview of what those bills are?
Sure. So in the spring of last year, spring 2024, the UCP government announced that it would be passing a series of laws affecting trans and gender diverse youth. And then those bills were eventually introduced last fall, and they were passed in December of 2024. Bill 26 prohibits sex reassignment surgery for minors and prescriptions of hormone therapy, including things like puberty blockers and hormone replacement, for youth under the age of 18. And the law applies regardless of the opinions of the youth themselves, their parents, and medical professionals. There are going to be exceptions created for minors who are age 16 and 17 who have parental, physician, and psychologist approval, or who have already started hormone therapy. And those exceptions are for the hormone therapy specifically. Then we have Bill 27, which applies in the context of education. And what it does is restrict the ability of trans and gender diverse youth to use gender-affirming names and pronouns without parental consent if they're under the age of 16. If they're over the age of 16, so 16 or 17, parents will still be notified of any changes in the youth's names and pronouns that they're using at school. And there's no clear exception in that law for youth who may be at risk of harm if their parents were to be notified of their wish to use gender-affirming names and pronouns. So that's Bill 27. The other thing Bill 27 does is create a new opt-in requirement for parents when their children are going to be presented with materials at school on gender identity, sexual orientation, and human sexuality. So previously, there was an opt-out type of scheme so that parents had to be notified of that type of content and they could opt their children out. But under the new changes to the law, all parents will have to opt in. And any teaching or learning resources from third parties will have to be approved by the minister. And then lastly, we have Bill 29, which is a sports-related bill, and it mandates schools and sports organizations to develop and implement policies on fairness and safety in sport, which sounds pretty broad and generic. And there's not a lot to the law right now, but something that it's important to mention is that when the bill was being debated in the legislature, the government said that the goal of the bill was to ensure that biological female athletes are able to compete in female-only sports. So those, in a nutshell, are what the three laws cover.
And it's quite an extensive sort of range of things that they're covering. In these areas, obviously you said there briefly of what would happen in comparison to it used to be an opt-out, now it's an opt-in. In some of the other areas, was there legislation already in place, or is this sort of filling sort of an area where it used to be discretionary, or how did the kind of legal landscape look like before these bills came in?
Yeah, so in Alberta specifically, I'm not aware of policies on names and pronouns that existed before Bill 27 came into effect. It may be that different schools had their own policies, but there was certainly no government-wide policy. And with respect to health-related matters, really it was a matter between the youth and their parents and the medical professionals in that person's life. And so, again, there weren't any overarching government rules that applied in those situations. But there have been some developments in some other provinces that I should perhaps mention, because it seems that Alberta in some ways was following the lead of these other provinces, but then it also went its own way in a couple of important respects. So New Brunswick was the first province to enter into this area, and back in July of 2023, they created a policy in the school context saying that students under the age of 16 could only use gender-affirming names and pronouns if they had parental consent. They also said some things in this policy about providing support for children who were potentially at risk of harm if they were in the situation where they needed to obtain consent. That law or policy, I should say, ended up being challenged by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and eventually a new government came into place in New Brunswick, and they revised the policy to be more supportive of trans and gender diverse youth. Saskatchewan was the next policy to enter into the field. They created a policy in August 2023, which was pretty similar to New Brunswick, focused on parental consent for students under the age of 16 seeking to use gender-affirming names and pronouns at school. There was another court challenge that was brought against that policy by an organization called You Are Pride. They got an injunction, which means basically an order from a court stopping the government from proceeding with this policy based on violations of Section 7 and 15 of the Charter. So I should pause here and say that the Charter is part of our Constitution. It guarantees under Section 7 the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and under Section 15 the right not to be discriminated against. And so a court in Saskatchewan found that both of those sections of the Charter were engaged by this policy in Saskatchewan and granted this injunction. Then the Saskatchewan government, this is quite a complicated legal history, but what they decided to do at that point was to change the policy into a law. And they invoked Section 33 of the Charter, which is the notwithstanding clause. And what that notwithstanding clause allows is for a law to apply without those Charter protections being available to people who wish to challenge the law. That resulted in further litigation, and now the case is before the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal on the issue of what the role of courts is when the government has used the notwithstanding clause. Like, is it still open to a court to say the rights of trans and gender diverse youth were violated in this case, and I can't strike the law down because of the use of Section 33, but I can at least let everyone know that this is a violation of the Charter, and then perhaps when it comes time to vote next time around, the people in that province would decide not to vote in a government who had overridden the rights of trans and gender diverse youth in this way. So that's kind of the situation in these other provinces. And when Alberta, people were, I think, expecting that the Alberta government was going to pass a law in these areas. But I think what surprised people was that they didn't just focus on the education context. They went beyond that and targeted trans and gender diverse youth in the healthcare context as well. And
in kind of that expansion of the topic, is there a reason that you think that Alberta specifically kind of broke ground in what they covered with this bill?
Yeah, it's a hard question to really try to think about what the motivation behind these laws is. We're talking about a very small group of people. We're also talking about one of the most vulnerable groups in society. These laws aren't restricted to the Canadian context, and I think it's important to mention that the U.S. has really been a big battleground for these kinds of laws. So starting around 2020 in the U.S., there really started to be a proliferation of these kinds of anti-trans laws. And some statistics I was looking at earlier this morning said that we've gone from, or the U.S. has gone from about 150 anti-trans bills in 2021 to over 700 so far this year alone, and we're only in March. So most of those bills in the U.S. are in the education context, followed by health and sports. So I think we have to put this situation into a bit of an international context as well. The other thing to mention is that there was a big report in England called the Cass Report that made some recommendations around healthcare for trans youth. But that report was released after the UCP's policy announcement. So I don't think we can really assume that report was the basis for what the UCP decided to do in the healthcare area. Some people have argued that conservative governments are basically looking for a scapegoat group to create a kind of moral panic that aligns people around a particular issue. Because when we think about it, what is the harm that trans and gender diverse youth using gender-affirming names and pronouns, what harm is that doing to other people in society? We've seen this previously over history. Often particularly conservative governments will scapegoat particular groups, racialize people in the past. Gays and lesbians who wanted marriage equality rights were scapegoated when, again, allowing marriage in that context was not doing harm to others. I think there's a bit of a different spin on this issue, though, which is that because we're dealing with youth, governments are able to make the argument that they are seeking to protect youth. And there's this rhetoric that youth are being groomed to claim transgender identity or gender diverse identity when that is not actually in keeping with their own beliefs. There's really no evidence to support this idea of grooming being some huge issue that we need to deal with in society. But nevertheless, these governments, I think, have been able to kind of capture that rhetoric and put themselves in the position of protecting these youth from harm, which makes it somewhat more difficult to challenge what's happening.
Yeah, I feel like whenever there's sort of the save the children, protect the children, it's tough because it's obviously on its face an important thing to do. It's an objectively good statement, but I feel like it does always get tied to these questionable sort of motives or questionable evidence. And now the term itself kind of has a less meaningful sort of, when it's put in use, it kind of feels a little less authentic these days. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this whole wave of parental rights arguments has been really interesting to follow. And I don't know if there's kind of a clear point that it started to pick up speed here, but what about our current kind of situation has made parental rights that cause that we're rallying, that these legislations are sort of rallying behind at the moment?
Yeah, parental rights, I think, is another really important angle on this whole issue. So, on the one hand, you have governments saying, well, we're seeking to protect trans youth. But then on the other hand, you also have these same governments saying, well, parental rights is something that's also very important. And the two concepts are linked in a sense because part of the argument is, well, parents need to know what's going on with their children in order to truly be able to protect them. But then the parental rights argument goes further than that, because it really extends to the idea that, well, even if youth want to be able to use gender-affirming names and pronouns, parents should still have the right, nevertheless, to override that, even if it's not in the child's best interests, which is really problematic. And then when we get to the healthcare reforms, parental rights are completely absent from that context. And so even if a parent supports their child receiving hormone therapy, and even if that's what the youth's medical professionals recommend, parental rights have no weight in that context. And so I think something that needs to be pointed out, and I'm not the only person to say this, certainly, is that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the messages that these laws are sending. Parental rights is really the focus in the context of names and pronouns at schools, but then parental rights have absolutely no place when it comes to the healthcare decisions that trans and gender diverse youth are making. So in many ways, that seems to me to say that these laws are somewhat arbitrary, and I think that's an important argument to make when we're thinking about the legal challenges to these bills. Now, that's not to say that parental rights is not a thing, and our law does recognize that parents have rights. For example, they have the right to make medical decisions on behalf of infant children, because that's seen as being a fundamental decision that's protected on the basis of the right to liberty under Section 7 of the Charter. But that right has limits. It always has to be exercised in the best interests of the child. And there's a number of cases involving things like blood transfusions, for instance, parents not wanting their children to have blood transfusions or other sorts of medical treatment for religious reasons. And courts have always said the overarching consideration in these cases is the best interests of the child, regardless of any parental rights. We also have to recognize that once youth reach a particular level of capacity, they have the ability to make medical decisions on their own behalf, regardless of their parents' wishes. And so having these bright line rules that says, under the age of 16, youth basically don't have the capacity to choose their own names and pronouns without parental consent. They don't have the capacity to decide that hormone therapy is in their best interest, regardless of what their parents say or their medical professionals say. That really goes counter to what we understand about the capacity of youth to be able to make their own decisions once they reach the capacity to do so.
And that, I feel like, will be, when you say that, kind of the legal challenges will be interesting to see how that plays out sort of in the courts. Especially given that Saskatchewan on only the pronouns and sort of the education side of it has already kind of gotten into the courts, and Alberta has stepped that one step further into healthcare, which I feel like always is a more contentious and protected sort of field as well. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that in the Alberta legislation, which I guess my question as I'm going is going to be twofold, is one, why do you think they chose legislation as opposed to policy? And then when they decided to draft these bills, why they did not include the notwithstanding clause, because that obviously would protect them from some of the things that are probably coming down the pipeline legal challenge-wise.
Yeah, so those are interesting questions. And maybe we should just say a little bit about the difference between a law and a policy in case we have any listeners who are wondering about that. So I think the first point to recognize is that policies can also be challenged under the Charter. And so when something doesn't reach the stage of being a law that's debated in the government, in the legislature, and that eventually sort of passes and becomes a statute, that can clearly be challenged under the Charter, but policies can be challenged under the Charter too, and that the Saskatchewan case is a good example of that happening. I actually think in some ways it was a positive thing that the Alberta government chose to put these things into a law rather than a policy, because it did allow for that sort of legislative debate to take place. A government can pass a policy without the need for there being any debate in the legislature. They can just do that sort of thing unilaterally. And so at least by introducing these ideas by way of the legislative process, it did allow us to have a real discussion about this as a province. And many members of the opposition raised serious concerns about these three bills. Now, that being said, the UCP has a majority in the legislature, so it means that they were able to override the concerns of the opposition and to pass these bills into law regardless of that opposition. And what that now means is that the government is going to have the option to consider whether to use the notwithstanding clause, Section 33. So again, the notwithstanding clause is this very powerful tool in the Charter that allows governments to pass laws that apply notwithstanding particular rights and freedoms. Section 7 and Section 15 of the Charter, which are really some of the key rights that are involved in these policies, are rights that the government can override using Section 33. Premier Smith was asked about this at the time that these laws were passed. Why hadn't she used Section 33 of the Charter? And her response was that she believed that these laws could be justified by the government. So we should also note that we have something called Section 1 of the Charter, which allows the government to argue that even though laws may violate people's rights and freedoms, nevertheless, those laws are justified sort of in the greater social good, or perhaps because they are protecting trans and gender diverse youth, although I don't think that's a particularly strong argument in this case for some of the reasons I've already mentioned. It's still open to the government if a court were to strike down these laws under the Charter. It's still open to the government to amend the law and to invoke the notwithstanding clause at that point. And really, that was how the notwithstanding clause was originally envisioned by the framers of the Charter. They did not believe that Section 33 was going to be used preemptively by governments to prevent courts from ruling on the constitutionality of laws. It would be used more as a response after a court had made that kind of ruling in order to protect whatever other sort of greater objectives the government was relying on. I think we really have to question the use of Section 33 in cases involving vulnerable minorities in society, because the whole premise of the Charter is to protect minority rights regardless of what the majority thinks. And so once we allow the government to use Section 33 in this way, it really does interfere with our whole premise of the Charter, which is the protection of the rights of vulnerable groups. Now, there is one other thing about Section 33 that we should mention, and that is that they only those kinds of declarations that a law applies notwithstanding the Charter only last for 5 years. And so the idea is that if the citizens of a province, the voting public, is upset enough about the government's use of Section 33, they then have the opportunity to exercise their democratic rights, and Section 33 does not apply to democratic rights under the Charter. They can vote that government out. And we just had a really important decision from the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago on Section 3 of the Charter, which is the democratic rights provision of the Charter, saying that it requires an informed right to vote. And so if a government is kind of interfering with access to information that could assist the public in really making that sort of informed choice about who they're going to vote for, that is problematic under the Charter.
And that is all for part 1 of our PBSC Hearsay episode with Jennifer Koshan. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be broadcasting part 2 in the coming months. Thanks.